Hello, I'm Darren Grimes, Digital Manager at the IEA. And this week on Live from Lord North Street, I'm joined by freelance writer and filmmaker with a particular interest in education economics and currently at WAG TV, the television production company, Sophie Sandor. Also joining Sophie is the IEA's Editorial Manager, Madeline Grant. Sophie and Madeline take a look at state education in Britain, which currently operates in a near monopoly for all but the wealthiest. They look at why there has historically been so little room for innovation and disruption in the sector, and why educational outcomes vary greatly dependent on your household income. Finally, Sophie outlines policies which could invigorate education in Britain by promoting parental choice. If you like what you hear, be sure to subscribe to our podcast channel, IEA Conversations. Right, Sophie, I felt like I had to get you in to do a podcast after I'd read your fantastic blog on how low-cost private schools are transforming education around the world and why we should let them do the same in Britain. The IEA blog, by the way, is absolutely fantastic under Maddie's stewardship, so definitely listeners should check that out. But in this piece, Sophie, you set out that in this country, the lower parents' income, the more our taxpayer-funded system thwarts the ability to attain the best possible education available for their child. Can you explain to our listeners why this is the case?
So in the UK today, you're either one of a tiny percentage who attend a private school, or you're one of the vast majority who attend a state school. Schools in the UK vary massive in quality, and your ability to attend one of the best schools is highly dependent on the income of your family, and indeed your parents, who are paying for your education. Economics can be used to explain why this system that is supposed to help the poor gives the poorest the worst deal. As you rightly said, Darren, the lower parents' income, the more the system thwarts their ability to choose the best available skill. The system is actively preventing parents from exercising choice if they have a lower income. So what it's like is, and this is the same with healthcare, money is effectively being transferred from the rich to the poor, and the poor are forced to spend it on certain skills effectively.
Yeah, as Sophie says, there's a real absence of choice. Even within the comprehensive system, outcomes are still hugely aligned with parental income. You know, in wealthier areas, there is a kind of postcode lottery that often springs up where you can have a street where houses on one side of the road are in one particular catchment area, houses on the other side of the road are in a different catchment area. And because, let's say, the two catchment areas are for completely different quality schools, one much better than the other, you can find that will impact the house price by up to, £100,000 or more. So this idea that we live in a world where, it's privileged in favour of the 7% who attend private schools, but for everyone else it's kind of equal sharing of misery, is actually not true. There's this postcode lottery element that we have to take into account.
And I want to ask both of you, that since the free schools revolution and other reforms in education like it, and at a time when the government is constantly claiming or parroting the line that there are now 1.9 million more children in good or outstanding schools than there were in 2010, are things as dire for the poorest in society than you allude to?
As Maddie said, you can try to get rid of markets, but it almost never works. Things are relatively bad for the poor. The Labour just released a statistic showing that the poorest are 9 times more likely to attend an inadequate school, as rated by Ofsted, than the wealthiest income background children. It's a bizarre system when you think about it, especially with the house prices affecting schooling.
And it's house prices actually that are making the problem that Maddie just raised with the catchment areas 10 times worse, isn't it? Because it's only those who can afford to live in those houses and with those good schools. And actually having a good school really raises the price of the housing in that area because, of course, more people want to live. And it's like our current system is fixed to benefit middle to upper class parents, isn't it?
Yeah, the idea behind it all is providing an equal education for everyone, but it doesn't end up like that at all. Recently, the Sutton Trust released a report, and it found that parents of the most affluent backgrounds are engaging in all sorts of tactics like buying a second home, or, as we just mentioned, buying a home in an area where they have higher performing state schools. Which way the causation goes isn't exactly clear, we just know there's a correlation. The better state schools are in the wealthier areas, so you can get access to a better school that way. Private tutoring, which is obviously going to help your child get into a selective state school or a private school. So there are all of these tactics that parents are engaging in and using money to do so. Everyone loses out in a modestly designed schooling system. Everyone isn't going to be happy with what's provided when we're forced to pay through taxes and we don't get a rebate if we don't want to use the state school service. Mm-hmm. The poor, obviously, are least likely to be able to correct what is wrong with the system for them, because their money has already been spent on taxes. And it's a little strange to think about it because not everyone even has children. 18% of women over 45 did not have children a few years ago. So it's even more bizarre than healthcare or transport, because almost everyone uses the health system or transport.
You've wrote quite eloquently on the way influential people in public life promote and perpetuate this system, ignoring the realities that you've just set out.
I'm making a documentary, a feature-length film, Why the Poorest Get the Worst Deal Out of the UK's education system. It will look at the incomes affecting ability to access the best skills, but the reasons why many people disagree with, and this film will look at it from an economic and philosophical perspective and basically show why there's been a crowding out of the private sector, and so now it's become elite. It's providing a very expensive product for a small section of society, and there's a massive gap in the market for something lower cost. And so we'll look at recent revolutions like the low-cost private school that's just been opened in Darren, or the beginning of a revolution. It's very small, one school at the moment, and how challenging the state's monopolisation of education can begin to make it easier for lower income families to access better schools.
Because the caricature I think that you get in your head when we hear the word private school, you think of Boris Johnson, you think of David Cameron, you think of that stereotypical Etonian.
Yeah.
But actually it doesn't have to be this way, does it?
It didn't used to be that way at all. My grandparents were not wealthy people. In the 1960s, my grandma was a part-time dinner lady and a housewife. My granddad was a bank clerk for Lloyd's. But their son was doing badly at school and they were able to afford to send him to a good private school. Michael Gove, his dad was a fishmonger. He was able to save up and send him to a very good private school in Edinburgh. That kind of experience is being written from the history books. That's simply not happening anymore. Of great concern, I think, if you read newspapers like the Daily Telegraph, which is predominantly a kind of middle-class audience, that they have a huge focus on education. Many of the articles seem to be about the unaffordability of private school and about finding good value for money private schools that you could actually send your child to. Those middle class families have been priced out of the system. So I think the time is very ripe for the experiment that Professor James Tooley is doing in Durham with the low cost private schools. I think what is most interesting about the project, which has only just been going since the beginning of term this year, is the way that left-wingers are absolutely terrified that James Tooley's school will be a success. Because the way I see it, the reason I believe they're terrified is because actually per head spending on his schools is actually less on average than the average state school spending on one of its students. The reason they're scared is that left-wing arguments are often predicated on the idea that the only problem, the only shortcoming of a policy is that not enough money has been spent on it. So, if we have some kind of problem, it's like, well, let's just throw more money at it.
Like the health service.
Precisely. And if James Tooley's school achieves better results with lower per capita spending, it will, I think, debunk once and for all this idea that you can simply solve problems by throwing money at it.
I agree completely with that. And also, I think another reason we're seeing a lot of opposition to James Tooley's school is, again, a flaw with the system. So what we've got is supplier capture, as economists call it. Basically what that means, it's been run more for the benefit of the supplier than the consumer. I was faced with some of the opposition to the new low-cost private school opening. Had a conversation with them when I was giving a talk back in a couple of months ago. And they said, well, what if this new low-cost private school is better and the local state school starts to lose pupils? And I said, well, first of all, if the population's increasing, it would just fill that demand anyway. But if not, and the school is better, then I suppose the school would close down because the state school would close down because it wouldn't have enough pupils. This was a point of great concern for the teacher in the state school. But that shouldn't be the main concern. If a school's not good enough, then, oh no.
Absolutely.
Oh no, it could have been done better. But the main fear was losing the job, and the system is propping up a lot of people.
Yeah. in this very anti-market way of thinking.
Yeah.
The idea that you're entitled to a job in perpetuity, and that, it just shows the absence of competition and a competitive mindset.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that you would actually have to compete in order for parents to send their kids to your school. It's just the idea of it runs contrary to their
That's the entire
views.
right. But I mean, fee-paying parents of private school children wouldn't put up with the consequences of having a really poor school that cares more about, I don't know, saving their own job or less about the education of the child itself.
Exactly. Yeah, I recently said that about school exclusions. It was a typical example.
Is this disruption in classes? Is this pupils that act up and disrupt the education of other children? Yeah.
The person who edited my article named the title, the state school system has been hijacked by the well-off and it's hurting the poor. I wouldn't have put it quite so extremely, but then I thought that was actually a good way of describing it. I was talking about the recent debate over school exclusions. In July, the Education Select Committee released a report. It basically saw rising exclusion rates as a massive problem. Now, obviously, if you're an economist thinking about statistics, the first question is, well, were they abnormally low before? So there's all that to consider, but just taking it at face value, say exclusions were massively rising, and this was assumed to be a bad thing and unfair on kids who are being excluded. And the funny thing is, it's educationalists, it's the educational establishment or vocal parents. It's a whole group of people whose voice and opinion we hear and who are influential in education. And their children are very unlikely to ever be enrolled in the schools where
Kids are being excluded.
Yes.
where kids are being excluded or exclusions need to happen. And they're criticising schools for having high exclusion. It's a very complex issue because some are doing it illegally to get them off the roll and to get exam results higher. But where it's happening completely fine, and even discouraging it, is not a good idea because, as you said, they would not have their child go to a school where it's difficult to exclude. If they want to, they should be able to send their child to a school like that, but it's never viewed like that. Decisions are made across the system, and they're harder to correct. It's harder to find out when it's going wrong. That's one of the problems with the system-wide decisions. So exclusions are an example of the establishment taking decisions that are harmful to the children who are in schools where the consequences bite the hardest.
It's a really, really interesting point about the people who are monopolising the debate are very much not those who have to live with the consequences of this. I cannot tell you how many articles I've read in The Guardian or The Independent where you have some kind of journalist who talks about the joy of, the child learning in a kind of collaborative way and how we need to do away with kind of learning things off by heart, the monotony of book learning and actual, the learning of facts and all this kind of thing, as though these are outdated concepts, they're very passé, rather than, actually quite crucial ways of helping a child's brain to develop the acquisition of knowledge, basically. At the same time, as Sophie points out, many of these people either live in areas where they're very good catchment areas for schools, or they don't. And when that happens, you very often get people like Diane Abbott who decide that actually the well-being of their child matters rather more than their being able to hold your head up high at a Islington dinner party, and they end up sending their kid to a fee-paying school or a selective school because they can. And ultimately, given the choice, parents will always do what's best for their child. And it's just a tragedy that there are so many people who are currently being locked out of that.
To me, it's absolutely disgusting. I don't know how anyone can justify, or anyone who claims to be egalitarian or pro-equality can argue that those who are unhappy with their local state schools but don't have the finances to do something about it are essentially trapped, aren't they? There's nothing they can possibly do. It's because we don't have those alternatives that you've set out available.
And notice how also the state is now playing the role of parents.
Yes.
It's determining on behalf of the parents how the parent wants to discipline their child. If you believe that your child does need structure and discipline, you should be able to find a school that can offer that. And if you, for example, if you want to send your kid to a choice, the system is currently acting as though any semblance of parental choice is a bad thing. That said, we have seen a growth in things like free schools and, of course, the low-cost private schools. But, in the main, this stuff makes up a very small minority of overall educational provision.
So is this a case of nanny knows best, Sophie?
Yeah, well, one argument is that parents don't know best, educational experts know best, but that shows a complete ignorance of how markets work, because in everything we rely on word of mouth and condensed research in the media to make decisions about things. And so parents do actually know best, and they have an incentive to, we know that because we see the strategies that parents are engaging in, like pretending to be religious and
Yes.
buying second homes and moving to wealthier areas and getting tutors in order to get into schools. I mean, clearly, parents do know.
And also the educational expert may know, loads about different methods of teaching, but they don't know the child in question, whereas the parent does. They're likely to know much better what, the bespoke solution for that child.
Yeah, and you mentioned teaching methods, and I thought that's another example, just like exclusions, of how the system-wide decision and the way the educational establishment harming the poorest. I think that anyone should be able to send their child to any kind of school they want to, whether that be progressive teaching methods or what's called traditional, but really it's just where the science is. So like memorization, rote learning, drill and kill as it's called, basically just memorization. High discipline, this is all called traditional, but really it just means what works. But the thing is, there are people advocating whose children are never going to suffer with basic literacy and numeracy. They advocate progressive teaching methods across the board. That's a problem.
A one-size-fits-all.
A one-size-fits-all. And that harms people who are already struggling with that the most.
Yeah. And also people who will never actually have to be a teacher in a struggling school.
Yes.
And then telling them that you can't impose exclusions, you can't suspend people, you can't impose rules about silence and that kind of thing. I saw someone in The Guardian complaining because there was a school that had a policy of silence between lessons. Now, I mean, that strikes me maybe as a little OTT, to have complete silence between lessons. But also, you don't know that school in question. You don't know why that policy was introduced. It may be that was the last resort after a period of other methods that weren't working. Every child is different, every school is different. And so often it's people from a position of safety, essentially, failing to check their privilege.
Well, speaking of checking privilege, you've got state schools where there are kids like yourself who, how old were you when you were writing for the Scottish Conservatives about how you went to a school that bottomed the league table and too many of your former classmates were left behind by an education system that fails too many?
Yeah, I was 19. That was just before I came to London.
I mean, so young. And do you not think that there is an argument that your classmates that you wrote about then would have been better off in, say, a grammar school, selective education?
Maddie mentioned politicians doing this. I mean, it's so apparent. It just shows why this is a perverse system. People are able to game it. The solution is obviously to start to challenge the state's monopoly with entrepreneurship. But it's not easy because the state is obviously making it actively difficult and favouring government programmes like free skills.
Yeah. Part of the problem is not just that the state has a monopoly, but it's that the state for so long has had a monopoly that many parents actually wouldn't know how to use the choice if they had it, because the decisions have been taken away from them for such a long time. It's a bit like reform of the NHS is often resisted because people don't know what the alternatives would look like, and they assume the worst case scenario is some kind of dysfunctional American system where people don't have access to healthcare. I think it might be something similar with education, that people don't feel as though they could be informed.
Well, I agree. I think if I was to go back home and say, would you send your child to a free school? Most people would say, what's that?
Well, that's another reason also why it's so difficult for the entrepreneur paving the way for the first time, because parents they might be tentative. So it is a difficult thing to do. It's a big challenge, and that's why it's very commendable what James Tilley is doing. And he directs the E.G. West Centre at Newcastle University, the Education Centre, and Edwin West wrote Education and the State in the 1960s, I think it was published. That outlines just how the private sector was providing education and the poor were educated completely before the state stepped in. So we know that it's possible and it happens.
Sophie, I guess one of the problems that I would have with a low-cost fee-paying school is that a parent would not be unjust in arguing that they are paying taxes for their kids' education, yet they would be paying even more on top of that. So essentially they'd be paying double towards their child's education than someone who was just sending their kid to a state school. Do you think the answer to that is they get a tax rebate and then that's less pressure on public finances?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is the best idea. And until that happens, that's why it's very difficult for entrepreneurs to step in and provide education, because why would you pay for it when you're already getting it for free? Yes, it might be worse if it's for free and if you're in a bad catchment area, but how much better does it need to be before you're willing to pay for the education over again? And it's quite tricky to provide it at a lower cost, although not as impossible as many people think. They think, oh, how on earth can this be done? You're cutting the cost on teachers or whatever. I've heard James Tilley be questioned. I don't know the exact secret formula, But I do know that there are many frills that can be cut in schools, and it is really bizarre that everyone is paying for everything that is provided by schools when some parents might not want the Olympic swimming pool or the theatres or the extracurricular activities.
Yeah,
or,
that's so
It's a
true.
really good
all
point.
of the additional classes, like, well, many of them you have to teach by law in state schools, like religious education and PSE, personal and social education. But there are many frills that can be cut, hence why this low-cost private school in County Durham that just opened in September is being called a low-cost.
How
No
low
frills.
cost is low cost in that school in County Durham?
I think it's less than a third.
I mean, as Sophie said, that's a really good point. If you're not good at music, but you're at a school where there is an amazing musical theatre, you probably have every reason to feel slightly aggrieved by that because your parents' taxes are paying for this service that you will never use. It makes much more sense to have different types of school that can offer different types of service, so that a child who isn't a musician but perhaps is really, really academic, to have the resources directed towards what they're best at. It's such a simple idea. It's almost astonishing that we've never had it incorporated in any way in our system before.
Imagine it with any other system, like hotels or supermarkets. I really liked in 2017, there was a Think lecture, which is the IE's Economics Conference for Young People, of course, and I used to help organise it when I worked at the IE. There was an education lecture, and it was said, imagine that this system were applied to food. So obviously you can go to a school for free, provided you attend a state school, and imagine the government nationalised Tesco. You could go to the state supermarket and get your food for free. The first consequence would be crowding out, and that's what we see in the state school sector. No one is going to go to a supermarket, a private supermarket, really, most people, when they can go to a free one, especially if they've already been taxed to pay for the food. The service of, if the state provided food, would be disgusting.
And the food itself, quite possibly.
Imagine a state-owned restaurant.
Yeah, I mean, the
be
food
like
would be
Faulty Towers on acid.
So you can imagine how.
Yeah, it's
how
a
that
really
would
good
play
point.
out. Yeah.
But because education is considered, well, it is, it's a kind of unqualified social good. People never consider market forces in this way, much like the NHS. They forget that it's often talked about being a free service, but of course you've already paid for it. And this is obviously basic. I think the semantic differences are very important. That we so often talk about services that have been prepaid via our taxes as free, that actually changes the way that people conceptualise the world. And it means that people like James Tooley have a harder time than they otherwise might have done.
I want you to answer me a question, Sophie. Put yourself in this scenario. Theresa May picks up the phone and she says, Sophie Sandor, I'm going to make you a peer of the realm and then make you Secretary of State for Education, and you can implement your ideal vision of how the UK should do education. What is the first thing that you do?
It would have to be people get a rebate if they don't want to use the state schools. And then we would immediately see if people would open skills. Entrepreneurs would be opening skills. They're already trying to do it now, and it's incredibly difficult because people don't have the money to spend on the skills and they're disincentivised from doing so. So yes, it would be a rebate that you can spend on education. That would be the first simple step, and the market would do the rest.
And then what would you say to the natural response, I think, would be, well, Secretary of State, what you've done is something that should be free. Education is a right. How dare you try and monetise education?
They can still spend it on the state schools that are there. No one is forced to do anything. They can continue as normal as they want, and I doubt many people would.
Yeah. Yeah, the fact that so many people have been willing to invest in this absolutely brand new venture, and it's been facing serious heat from all sorts of commentators. And you consider that it's still managed to open this September and it's functioning despite all of those obstacles. I think it shows you just how high and how serious the appetite is for an injection of consumer choice into a market that is otherwise a state monopoly that leaves very little room for innovation, disruption and new ideas.
It is funny when people say education is not about the money. It's not about the money, because we don't say that about anything else. We don't say it about when we buy groceries. Of course, it's not about the money. It's more about the food. You value the food more than you value the money in your pocket, hence why you bought it.
Yeah.
So it's completely not about the money. But somehow that's applied to education.
Yeah.
If you spend money on education, surely for you it's more about
Of course
You
it is.
value the education more than the money you're spending on it.
And you've pointed out so many ways in which, despite, this apparent state system that we're in, parents find ways of spending money, they find ways of scrimping and saving, they find ways of, we call it gaming the system. I think that makes it sound like it's something a little almost dishonest. Mm-hmm. It's not. It's simply people trying to do the best that they can for their families, which is something that Tony Blair understood when he sent his kid to the oratory school, something that Diane Abbott understood when she sent her son to City of London Boys. It's something that all left-wing politicians fundamentally understand when push comes to shove, but it's something that, when it's brought up in the education debate, is treated as a malign, suspicious character trait.
A severe consequence of the way the educational establishment have taken over the decisions and hijacked the system, as it was put in that Telegraph headline. With exclusions and things like that in schools where there are issues with behaviour, it is overwhelmingly low-income children who are excluded children. If you're on free school meals, you're far more likely to be in a class with someone who is excluded or has been excluded or needs to be excluded. And so when it's difficult to exclude children, just to use that as an example, because I thought that was really emblematic of the whole issue, it increases inequality, because disruptive peers in the classroom, there was a study of this very recently, actually affects not only your grades at the time at school, but your future earnings, your labour market outcomes. And so if you're already more likely to be lower income, and then this is affected even more, it's definitely increasing inequality. We know that for a fact. And that's another reason why it's so perverse.
Yeah. Again, it's almost like goes back to the classic argument that you often run into, like, do you care more about inequality or do you care more about overall prosperity? And I think there are lots of people who, even if their kids are not going to be affected by the system, they would rather have a system that was overall a bit worse, provided everyone was apparently suffering equally under it. Everyone was getting the same lousy deal. And when people talk about parents who've scrimped and saved to send their kid to a private school, very often these parents are described as almost selfishly taking their kids out of the system and thereby taking some of the best performing kids out of the system and taking away the positive peer effect that well-behaved, well-disciplined kids will have in the state system. So it's actually very collectivist. It's kind of, greater good type thinking. As Sophie has so brilliantly put it with the supermarket example, it's a pernicious mindset that wouldn't be tolerated in any other area of public life. But somehow we tolerate it with education, which is about preparing future generations for life. So it could not be more important if it tried, and yet we still apply this same kind of reductive way of thinking.
Well, actually, after listening to the two of you, I really hope Theresa May does get on the blower and put you both in the House of Lords and set you away in education, because I think that these sort of things that James Tooley are doing, etc., are absolutely the way to go, and the more choice kids have, the better. What's more important than education? Thank you so much, Sophie and Maddie.
Thank you.
For more podcasts, blogs, reports and films, be sure to check out our website, iea.org.uk.